Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I'm joined by Ryan Callaghan to get a quick level set on where things stand regarding threats to public lands in early 2025 and a larger discussion around the best strategies that we can employ to protect those lands now and into the future, whether you are listening to this in 2025, 2030, or 30 more years down the road. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light. And to start today, I want you to close your eyes. Now, if you're driving, don't do that, please. But assuming you are in a safe place, close your eyes. Bear with me here. And imagine a piece of public land that has been special to you, a favorite place, a cherished place, somewhere that has lingered long into your memory because of a fishing trip or a hunting trip or an incredible wildlife encounter or an experience you shared with your son or your daughter or your mom or your dad. Think about this place, the first place that comes to your mind like that, and picture it. Imagine what it looks like. Imagine what it sounds like. The wind through the trees, the river flowing through the rocks. Smell it. Touch it. Remember what it feels like to be there. And then imagine if that place was gone. Imagine if you couldn't take your son or your daughter or your grandkids or your friend or your mentee there. Imagine if you couldn't go back because it was given away, sold off, it was cut down, or if a road was built through the middle of it, whatever it might be. Imagine that opportunity was no longer available to you. How does that feel? I don't like that thought exercise. I don't like the way that makes me feel. And I don't want that to happen. And that's why we are having this podcast here today. Because this podcast, at a very high level, is about what we can do as Americans, as hunters and anglers, to make sure that this never happens to your special place or my special place or anyone else here that loves our public lands. Whether these threats be now or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now. Because what I learned when I was working on my book was about the history of our public lands and the threats facing them in the future. When you look back in the hundreds of years long history of how we got these places, one of the biggest things that stood out to me while working on that wild country was this fact that these fights happen over and over and over again. Ever since we secured these lands as a shared inheritance for all Americans, there have been people trying to get their hands on them, trying to squeeze every penny they can out of them, trying to find ways to sell them off or milk them for more money or get them in some other person's control. Whatever it is, it continues and it will continue. And so we today are going to discuss some things going on right now in 2025 that are causing all sorts of buzz. If you've been following the media and the news, of course, there's a lot going on nationally, but a lot of that national conversation has ramifications for public lands and hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation. So we today are going to discuss a little bit of what's happening right now, but then I also, and what the biggest part of this conversation entails, is zooming out of 2025 and talking more generally about what we as hunters and anglers can do to be the absolute most effective advocates for public lands that we possibly can be. This is a strategy session. Me, my buddy Ryan Callahan, my colleague from MeatEater, the host of Cal's Weekend Review, one of the absolute leaders in the conservation and public land space. Today, we are going to brainstorm. We are going to spitball. We are going to whiteboard out different ideas and strategies and tactics and best practices for being the best possible version of a public land defense crew that we can possibly be. What have Cal and I learned over the years as we've studied these issues? What have we learned as we have participated in various nonprofit conservation organizations and as volunteers and as, folks that have created content around this and spoken to many of the leaders in this space? The game plan today is to try to really uncover the action items that we need to be taking right now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now, right on down the line. And, I think it has to be acknowledged that, to set the context here, to set the stage, there is a real swelling of energy around anti-public land ideas right now. The anti-public land movement has existed for many years. It's kind of gone up and down with support and power and opportunity and energy around it. And right now it's on the rise. As Hale Herring said, maybe 6 weeks ago when he was on the podcast with me, he said that movement is ascendant right now. There is a lot going on in the world right now, a lot going on nationally that's providing an opportunity for those people. So I want to, start here with an excerpt from an email that the CEO of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers just sent. This is Patrick Berry, and he wrote this, I quote, "The avalanche of foreboding attacks on public lands, combined with calculated misinformation campaigns designed to gaslight Americans into believing what's happening is in their best interest, has reached a crisis point. From Utah's U.S. Supreme Court lawsuit aimed at eroding the very foundations of federal land ownership to the transactional view that public lands are no more than a line item on a balance sheet, to the recent raft of political maneuvers setting the stage for a public lands liquidation, the drumbeat of selling out and selling off has become deafening." End quote. And it's not just BHA who's raising the red flag on this one. Similar concerns have been raised all across the outdoor media and conservation landscape. You can see it in the pages of Field and Stream and Outdoor Life and MeatEater. You're going to hear it from folks like Randy Newberg and Hal Herring and Andrew McKean and Steve Ranella and so many others. This is a across the board realization from many, many people that there's something going on right now. And it's going to require something on our end. Me and Cal are going to dive into questions and concerns and ideas related to everything from, how can we as advocates cut through the noise? How can we reach the people we need to reach, even though there's so much other stuff going on? How can we actually get our elected officials to listen to us? How can we rally big, diverse coalitions in support of public lands? How can we get conservation organizations to actually act and move forward on the things that we really need them to? How can we individually speak out about these issues more effectively? How can we be more effective in educating our friends and family members and work colleagues and all that kind of stuff? How can we kind of get outside of the partisan, polarizing, name calling and crap talking that so much of our politics are today? These are some of the things that Cal and I try to discuss. And I will say that, the first 30 minutes or so of the conversation with me and Cal here do kind of get to the, context of what's happening right now. We do a level set, some of the things that Cal's concerned about, some of the things that I'm concerned about, some of the current events right now in early 2025 that are, giving folks in the public land world some heartburn. So if you've heard enough, if you're very well aware of the situation in March 2025 and you don't need to hear more about that, you can fast forward maybe 30 minutes-ish. That's when we get to more of this tactical strategy session. But I don't think that I don't think it is, a bad idea to take stock of where we are right now, though, because there is a lot, and you've been seeing social media posts or you've been seeing the headlines with concerns raised about public lands, but you're not really sure of the details. I've had a lot of people commenting on some of my things on social media saying, well, what's the big deal? We have to lay off some people. What's the big deal with that? And so I think some people are aware of maybe like one tiny slice of what's happening, but haven't seen the full picture. So Cal and I do try to speak to more of that full picture, but let me give you a very quick rundown here so you have a sense of, this kind of stack of issues that keeps on piling up. And it has been for a number of years now. This isn't something that just began with the new administration. There have been folks, slowly accruing power, pushing for these ideas, for years. So one thing mentioned there in Patrick Berry's email was this lawsuit from the state of Utah asserting that the federal government was breaking the law supposedly by having and managing federal public lands, and the state of Utah demanded that the federal government give 18.5 million acres of federal public land to the state of Utah. That fortunately was not picked up by the Supreme Court. They decided not to hear that case, but it's very likely that that's going to rear its ugly head up again in some appeals court or something down the line. I think that was a strong signal of what's going on. More than a dozen other states, I thought it was somewhere around almost 20 different states signed on in support of that. So this isn't just a Utah thing. This is also a North Dakota thing. This is also an Iowa thing. This is also a bunch of other state governments agreeing and supporting that idea. Speaking of states supporting the idea of getting rid of public lands, the state Senate in Wyoming pushed through a big resolution, again, demanding that the federal government give over all the federal public lands they've got in the state of Wyoming. Now, that actually got passed at one point. That resolution was passed at one point by Wyoming State Senate. Fortunately, they don't actually have the powers to do that, to force the federal government to hand over their public lands, but that kind of thing's being proposed by Wyoming and other states. This kind of state control thing continues to get some interest in certain corners. Continuing down that line, a bill was recently introduced that's trying to remove the power of the presidency to use the Antiquities Act, which has been a tremendous tool for protecting public lands. Theodore Roosevelt was the first to do it and secured incredible places that we all enjoy today, such as the land that's now the Grand Canyon National Park and many others. Let's see. When it comes to, more recent high-level federal stuff, what probably most of you are aware of are the cuts that have happened at the federal level. And yes, there's important efficiency measures being taken, which I and many people can appreciate. But when it comes to public lands specifically, there's been some concerns there. More than 2,000 folks from the Department of the Interior were laid off, including more than 1,000 from the National Park Service. I also saw that another 700, I believe, took the pushed on them early retirement offering. So that leads to about 1,700 folks not at the National Park Service anymore. And that, I believe, was almost 10% of their staff. There was 3,400 Forest Service employees that were let go. That's about 10% of the Forest Service. And this isn't official yet, but the latest report I saw is that there is another push happening where they are asking for a push to lay off another 7,000 folks there. And these are agencies that were already understaffed, that were already underfunded. Budgets were slashed last year during the previous administration, and that passed Congress. So the agencies that are managing our public lands are facing really, really difficult conditions too. This is concerning. And then you also have further cost-cutting measures. Many of the grants and funds and budgets for these agencies and habitat programs are being either frozen or slashed. And then, on the flip side, there's the cost-cutting side, and then there's also the revenue side. And this is an inherent, what I would say, a good thing about public lands, but also a thing that you always have to be careful about, is the fact that revenues are raised from our public lands. They are a revenue source. They are meant to be a sustainable profit center, a sustainable resource in which there is extraction for gas and oil and minerals and timber and grazing. Those are opportunities that have been available on public lands and should continue to be available. The thing with our shared multi-use landscape is that all priorities need to be considered. And sometimes the pendulum swings one way too far and sometimes the other way. And right now, based on what we're hearing And based on many of the proposals and executive orders that we're seeing right now, it seems like the pendulum is swinging far, far to the extraction side. All other things being equal, there's a very high priority on drill, baby, drill, extract, baby, extract. Let's milk these things for as much money as we possibly can. So many executive orders recently and secretarial orders have been essentially laying the groundwork and asking for, the departments to start building out plans to take action on, fast tracking anything we can to get extraction and development projects underway. Things like getting drilling going in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Things like possibly going and getting the Ambler Road development in Alaska approved, even after it was denied last year after hearing from hunters and anglers. Things like taking any mineral withdrawals that were made during the last administration. So any places that, the government said, hey, this place is too special to mine or to extract. Let's not do it in this spot. Now they're looking to reassess and possibly remove those, such as the mineral withdrawal around the Boundary Waters Wilderness area that we've talked a lot about, and a whole bunch more examples like that. And, anytime when you talk national priorities, shifting priorities, and federal government, right, it can be touchy. It can make us defensive. And I want to be clear here that by talking about any of these things, whether it's right now in 2025 or when I talked about these things in 2021 or 2022 or 2019 or 2017, these aren't attacks on people. These aren't attacks on parties. These are simply, at least the way I approach it, I take an issue by issue perspective. I don't care who the president is. I don't care what party's in office. I just care about the specific ideas being put on the table and what they mean for hunting and fishing and the different things that we do on public landscapes. And so, right now we have, the Republican side does have more control right now, and they're doing plenty of good things, plenty of things that I would say, God bless you to them for. I appreciate the support that they are giving our firearm rights. I appreciate the fact that they are incredibly supportive of hunting opportunities and access and our way of life and, so many other things like that. I think most of us listening to this podcast are in support of a more efficient, smart government. Absolutely. But at the same token, I do not think that it is unpatriotic or un-American or unsupportive to also point out some warts when we see them. And here's the analogy I've got. The thing that kind of came to mind to me when I have talked about some of this stuff on social media, a bunch of people would write in and say, well, we got to have these cuts, or we have to do this thing because, we need to work down the deficit, or we need to make the government more efficient. And because of that, basically apologize and ignore any of these other things because the greater cause or this other cause is important. And my thought to that, my response to that is, okay, let's imagine going to the hospital and you got a broken arm and you recognize that you have a problem. Here's this problem. I got a big old broken arm. I need you to fix it. I need someone to fix it. You go in there to the hospital, and if they all of a sudden, before they fixed my broken arm, just started cutting off my right leg, I wouldn't just sit there and not ask any questions and just let them take it. No, I would say, hey, man, why do you got to take my right leg too? Are you sure you need to take my right leg? I really love my right leg. Can we think about this? Can we do this carefully? Can we explore other opportunities? Are you looking into every possible recourse you have? Let's be careful. I wouldn't just blindly let them go with it. And I think we maybe should consider a similar approach when it comes to our public lands, because yes, there are other problems that need to be fixed. And this is the case no matter who's in office. There's always going to be some other problem. And it's going to be our job as hunters and anglers and people that care about our public lands to say, hey, don't forget about our right leg. Don't forget about our public lands. Whether it be, the current administration wanting to put a new road through the wilderness up in Alaska to open up mines, or whether it be the past administration wanting to put up millions of acres worth of solar panels across wide open landscapes and destroy wildlife habitat in that kind of way. I think our job is to call a spade to whoever's in office. because, the wildlife and the wild places of America don't have a voice, but we do. So we need to speak up for them, no matter if we are Republicans or Democrats or independents, no matter if the president or Congress is Republican or Democrat. Regardless, we can, we should, and we need to speak up and take action for these things. So that is my long-winded rant to kick off this podcast. This one's going to be long, so apologies for that, but that's what I got. That's my intro. Like I said, me and Cal riff on this a little bit more, like I said, for maybe like 30-ish minutes. So if you want to get right to the strategy, fast forward from here. But I do hope this is going to be helpful for you now and well into the future. And while this episode today is about defense, there are offensive strategies that we can consider as well and that are available even now in the short term. So next week, we do have an episode and a couple folks coming on that are going to talk about opportunities that we have over these next few years, ways that we absolutely could have some conservation wins and maybe some public land wins. If we do our job and get our elected officials back on the right track, good things are possible. So we're going to talk defense, we're going to talk offense, we're going to talk about whatever we have to do, regardless of political party, regardless of where we live, what we do, whatever. We love these places. We love these opportunities. We're going to fight for them. All right. Now with me on the line, we've got the one and only Mr. Ryan Callahan. First off, just got to say thank you for hopping right out of bed this morning and joining me early on a Monday morning. I do appreciate that.
It's 8:30 in the morning, Mark. Left bed a long time ago, but
well, I don't know. You don't have kids. I don't know what world you're living in, Cal. It might be.
No, I got a dog who's up making up her mind whether to puke or not. So it's kind of like having kids. So
that's no fun. No
big deal. But no, yeah. Thank you for having me on. I know we've been talking about joining forces here for a long time, and we're honestly doing a pretty piss poor job of it. So this is a good step one here. So
yeah, got to start somewhere. And while we've done a piss poor job so far, I have pie in the sky aspirations for what we're going to do here today. We're going to do something that may not be possible, but I hope it is. So hear me out on this. I'm hoping that we can have a discussion today that is not just about current events. It will be about current events, but it's hopefully something that somebody could return to 2 years from now or 4 years from now or 10 years from now and still find helpful and relevant to whatever version of this world is happening for them then. That's kind of my goal for what we're going to do here. Because the idea for this, Cal, was that, I've been, as you have, thinking a lot about what's going on right now related to public lands, related to kind of this rising tide of energy for some ideas around, changing what we're doing with public lands, whether it be transferring them or defunding them or divesting of them or any other number of ways that this incredible public land inheritance that we have might be damaged. There's a lot of different stuff floating in the ether right now on that front. So I've been thinking a whole lot about what can I do? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? What can we as a community do? There's all these different ideas and there's all these different questions I have. And I got to thinking that maybe it would be best to do that kind of brainstorming and spitballing and figuring out the answers to those questions, not just in isolation, but actually with somebody else who's also doing the same kind of stuff. So rather than you and me sitting in our own little rooms thinking about this stuff and trying to figure out what the hell to do, maybe we should talk about it together and see if we can come up with some ideas or some lessons learned or look back on the past at what's worked and what's not. Maybe that can help inform us about what we should do moving forward. And gosh, I bet you there's a whole lot of people that'd be interested in that conversation between the two of you, so that this just doesn't benefit us, but also maybe is a toolbox or a game plan or a blueprint that could be used by all sorts of people now and in the future. So that's the pie in the sky hope. Is that asking too much, or is that possible?
Oh, I think very possible. Like the realistic building blocks, like the foundation for anything like this is really not going to change. So
Yeah.
we got it in us for sure.
Well, it's funny you say that because, in writing my book on this topic a handful of years ago, maybe the very biggest takeaway I had from that is that these same fights and battles and debates have been happening for decades. The specifics are a little bit different, but, supposedly Mark Twain said this. I don't know if it's actually him, but he says that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. And there's a lot of truth to that. and I think that will prove true with our current situation and what's to come, who knows how many years down the road. So that's a long-winded wind-up, Kel, to this. I think it would be useful, with all this about timeless being said, I do think it would be useful to have kind of a level set of where things stand right now with public lands. There's been tons in the news. You guys have talked about it on your podcast. There's been some discussion around it on the MeatEater podcast. We've all had social media posts that have brought up something related to these things. All the major media outlets are discussing, everything from layoffs to funding to executive orders to, every other which way and another. Me and Hal Herring had a conversation about this prior to the new administration coming on board back on January 16th. We have not had a conversation on this specific podcast, about, what's gone on in the 6 weeks since then. So to kind of get our foundation, I guess, could you run me through maybe the things right now that have you the most concerned, or that you're really paying attention to related to public lands over the last 6 weeks or so? What are the things that have been getting you, staying up late at night, doing a lot of research, doing a lot of thinking, wanting to be involved in these kinds of conversations? What are those top things right now?
Boy, I've been learning a lot about the national debt. For better or worse, I do kind of aggregate consistent arguments, and you hear the national debt brought up a lot. So I've been reaching out to folks whose job, economists that work on the national debt, or teach courses on the national debt, and picking their brains and asking the same questions of everybody, and then, expanding a little bit. So spending time there, because that just seems to be like, well, it's for the national debt, or this is all happening because we have to reduce the national debt. And then I also am interested in, because I'm kind of like a true believer, right? Like that'd be the category that I fall in, where I see immense value in public land, public water, public wildlife. That's where I've spent my life. That's where I've gotten a lot of personal growth and enjoyment, and I'm just anchored to it, right? So I do also pay attention to some of the arguments that kind of come from that same angle, but from the opposition point of view. So public lands, waters, and wildlife are a socialist ideal or a communist ideal. So I've spent some time going through some of those, which are interesting. And I think, right now, it's safe to say that there's a very, very good chance that public lands as we know them, which would be the big asterisk there, like as we know them, is are going to change. We know and have always known that there are, redundancies in, just like anybody who works for any sort of big corporation. There's a lot of redundancies. That's where like the B word, bureaucracy, comes in. And there's some waste for sure. But we also know that with the recent round of layoffs and impending layoffs, like the there's no consultation happening with leaders in the space. So nobody went to like the best foresters in the Forest Service and said, "Hey, this is our goal. What do we need to do?" Nobody went to the best district rangers and said, "Hey, this is our goal. This is what we do." Right? You run the best forest by these metrics in all of our national forests. Here's our goal. What do we need to do? That did not happen. And when you look at like these legacy federal employment rates, we peaked more or less in the late 70s, early 80s for federal employees. But really, we've maintained a more or less steady employment rate, and it's just where those employees are that has changed. And relative to our population growth and user growth,
visitation to these places,
right, we're at a all-time low relative to those rates. So you hear this other argument when we talk about employment of like, oh, well, they're just they're doing what corporations do, and they're laying everybody off, and then they'll backfill in. Well, if you've ever been in that position, it sucks. It's not a good thing. People are going on unemployment. It drastically affects not only their lives, but the lives of people around them, and our gross domestic product, which is tied to the unemployment rate in this country. And I think we want to get to like the good things that you can do, and here's like the positive message. And I think people bond around public land, public water, public wildlife for sure. So I'm very optimistic there, but I do want people to come away with this other thing. Like, what is going on right now is not reducing, nor in my estimation and all of my research will we see a reduction in national debt, in the debt this country carries. Even if you were to do the Mark Twain thing and like jump back and look at the last time an attempt was made to do this, our national debt still rose, right? So like Reaganomics in the 80s would be like the thing that people are pointing to. We didn't reduce debt then. We changed how we spent. And anybody listening to this show, anybody you run into on the street will tell you, without a doubt, saving money does not affect your debt. If you have a mortgage, a credit card, car loan, student loan, whatever, you can save all the money you have and put it in that jar. But unless you put it towards the principal, you are not reducing your debt. Like we know that. That is a fact. So it is very irksome to me when people are like, well, we got to reduce the national debt. That would be great. That is not what's happening here. I don't think it's the plan at all. And the only time that we're going to see a reduction in the national debt is if like President Trump came on and said yesterday, past tense, we matured all these treasury bills and notes, paid them off, and we will not issue them again. If that were to happen, that would be a reduction in national debt. And I don't think that's going to happen, right? I'd be super, super shocked if we don't see coming up here very soon a raising the lid on the national debt again. So we are saving money, but it's money that's already spent. Mm-hmm. We're putting it in, I don't even know what bucket. There's an optimistic view that once we reshuffle the deck and we have a surplus, which would again be in quotations, to reassign to other things, then we can fight to have that reassigned towards things that we care about, right? Like everybody's going to be fighting for that cash. There's a chance that we could fight hard enough and get that cash towards, new, efficient, ass-kicking management of the Forest Service, the BLM, Bureau of Rec, all that stuff. But I like to think that we're reducing national debt is just not. I am a D- macroeconomic one class University of Montana dude, right? And this is a fact. Like I've corresponded with a bunch of folks who do this as a living. Like when we talk about reducing the national debt in those terms, all it means is that we are going to attempt to raise our gross domestic product in relation to the national debt.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
So all these conversations around the national debt, and there's been interestingly a number of people talking about this outside of our world too. Like there's several opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal talking about this in ways that the federal lands, our public lands, might be used in this capacity to pay down on that or something. But here's the thing: when this is brought up and the issues of pulling back funding of public lands or divesting of public lands or laying off the workforce to cut costs, all these different things. One thing I've noticed when someone like you or myself or Steve or anyone from any other media organization or any individual brings up these things and says, well, this might not be such a good idea for reason A, B, and C. There's a whole flurry of voices who say what you just said. Well, we have to pay off the debt. Well, we have to sacrifice across the board to deal with these things. And I don't disagree in that there's plenty of, as you said too, plenty of room to improve efficiency, plenty of fat that could probably be cut, plenty of ways we need to make our government work better for us. Agree on all of those fronts. But what I would also say, and I made this analogy in the introduction to this separate, but if I go to the hospital and I've got a broken arm and I say, hey, will you fix my broken arm for me? If they come in and say, yep, we see that's a problem you've got there, we're going to fix your broken arm. That's great. But if at the same time they also mention, oh, by the way, we're also going to cut off your leg, I'm not just going to be like, all right, fine, yeah, because you got to fix my broken arm, so take my leg with it too. Why not? No, I'm going to ask some serious questions. I'm going to say, are you sure you need to cut off my leg? Is there anything we can do about that? Are there some alternative solutions? Can you very thoroughly explain to me why you're cutting off my leg? I'm going to fight for my leg. I'm not just going to willingly ask no questions, say, well, yeah, sure, you're my doctor, I love you, take my arm, take my leg, whatever you need. No, of course not. So I think that there's no reason why we can't ask serious questions about this. There's no reason we should feel bad about raising some concerns around it, because I really like my leg. I'd like to keep it around, and I'm not going to, feel like I'm not supporting my doctor just because he's doing something that maybe isn't going to help me all the way across the board. So in that case, I think these questions that other people are bringing up and that we're bringing up around the debt and the best way to deal with that problem, or around government efficiency and the best way to solve those problems, and making sure that in doing those important things, at least when it comes to the public land and wildlife issues that we know a lot about and care a lot about, that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's where we come into some serious concerns about what's happening right now. Because as you mentioned, there's a chainsaw approach that's maybe being taken right now, where a scalpel is probably more appropriate, and a scalpel being used very carefully with something that matters a lot to a lot of people, right? I think that's
absolutely
like my entry point to a lot of this is like it's okay to engage in that kind of way, because this stuff really matters. And a chainsaw is a powerful tool, but also a very dangerous one if not used carefully.
Yeah, and it matters to everyone. So the frustrating part here is public lands have been almost like a co-op approach for a long time, right? Um, Mother Nature's a beast. It throws a lot of curveballs at individuals and agencies. You could have a forest management plan that says we're going to, clear 1,000 miles of trail this summer. That's what our trail crews are going to do. And there could be a microburst and a windstorm, and they could very well clear 1,000 miles of trail, but it ends up being the same trail that they worked on all summer long because of crazy wind events. And that leaves thousands of miles of trail that is not going to get the attention of that trail crew. And the horse packers and the recreational folks, right? They're the ones who are clearing trail. And that's the way it's always been, really. Um, I think there's some frequency of some of those crews that I remember seeing a lot more when I was younger and hoofing it around. But um, don't have like the hard numbers to support how many trail crews are on the landscape right now. But I do know that there's been a heavy reliance on independent contractors to take care of all sorts of things on our public lands in the last over a decade, and a lot of those independent contractors who have built whole businesses in the private sector around these things are really hurting right now too, because of the federal funding freezes. So those things are going to have an impact on users. If I'm being honest, is it going to impact me a whole lot? Not that much, because I've spent a ton of my time parking in a wide spot on the road and heading up, uh, you know, terrain that is not family friendly or all that accessible to somebody who doesn't like to suffer a little bit. But it is darn sure going to impact the people who rely on maintained campgrounds, um, and just come to expect a certain level of service, maintained roads, for one, to get that fifth wheel into those spots, stuff like that, garbage
Yeah.
removal, pumping toilets. So and how many, you're of this age, and so many of my friends are, right? It's like I never ever thought we'd have a camper, but then you have a kid,
Kids.
2 kids, and it's like couldn't do it without it, right? Um, just makes things more enjoyable. You get a little time back, stuff like that, and those are the people that are going to see some real effects this spring and summer for sure.
Yeah.
Another super important thing, right? Like we got wildfires ripping in the Carolinas right now. Something that's not talked about is like a ton of this seasonal employee base, although not specifically assigned to fire, they plan on being assigned to fire in an emergency capacity, um, filling in extra spots when fire season starts to go. So they all have what's called a red card. They're
Yeah.
fire certified in order to do that. So it even though they're not specifically fire personnel, they absolutely do work on fire, especially once seasons get big.
Yeah.
So that's one part of this. Then we jump over to the announcement that was made over the weekend for like increasing timber harvest on public land. Hunters certainly know that there can be some real benefit to that new edge habitat that's created through timber harvest. Not always a bad thing by any means. It's certainly a renewable resource.
Yep.
We need timber. It can be done really well. The interesting thing here is, this is like your normal blanket statement, government bureaucracy stuff, right? Like that's one of the other pet peeves of mine, right? It's like there's no clearer example of big government than what's going on right now, of just like, yeah, fire all these people. Don't need to know what
Yeah.
they do. Don't need to know what's going on. So we've laid off a ton of folks whose job it is to go through our timber stands and calculate how many commercially viable board feet of lumber there are, mark off zones that say, hey, these trees have to remain in order to hold back stream bank sediment, allow fish to spawn, keep our streams and rivers healthy. Uh, places where a road can be established in order to get that commercially viable timber to market. Those people just got laid off. And
But then this executive order just came out saying they want to increase timber production dramatically, et cetera, et cetera. But now we don't have the staffing to do that in a smart way, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's really interesting that you need these people on the ground in order to actually make this stuff happen. We don't have a nationalized timber program, right? It's not the federal government going out there and taking trees to market. It's independent contractors, right? It's oftentimes like small independent, like family owned timber operations. And, like kids I grew up with and at Hellgate High School that, as soon as football season was over, they quit high school to go cut timber with their dads, right? It's those people that are out there doing this. And like there's not that much timber in certain areas that are under this big government, like, hey, this is where we want timber to come from. Black Hills being a great example. Like, there's not a lot of good timber there right now. Like, so we're kind of back in this situation of like, yes, we want to reduce fuels for wildfire mitigation, but the fuels that are there's not really a strong market for, especially if you got to burn a bunch of gas and time to get them. So we kind of go into this zone of us, the taxpayer, federal government. Are we going to pay these timber producers to go in there and extract timber that, basically like subsidize timber at the mill? And it could not be a mill, right? It could just be a chipping facility or a pellet facility type of thing, because that timber isn't what's going to go into building somebody's house.
Well, and I think that this is just one example of many in which, there's a bunch of things happening right now that I think it is fair to say is representative of just a pendulum shift strongly in one direction towards, fast tracking all extraction possible from these public lands, like milking every dollar we can from that. That's a higher priority right now for folks who are at the levers of power than it was. And so what you have is, as you just described, a situation where there might be some subsidizing of getting that stuff going on within our national forest, but maybe pushing it into overdrive. Same thing with gas and oil. Same thing with minerals. There's been this slew of executive orders trying to unleash, Alaska's energy potential, declaring an energy emergency, fast tracking any and all potential energy projects in the lower 48, review and possible rescission of any mineral withdrawals. Basically anywhere where any kind of protection was put into place or a speed bump was raised. With the new priorities, they're trying to remove that. Let's get as much oil, let's get as much timber, let's get as much every mine, et cetera, et cetera. That is kind of the trend that things are heading towards. You have places that we as hunters and anglers have, fought for years and years to protect, places like the Boundary Waters or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or, the Brooks Range there with the Ambler Road being proposed to be pushed through there. These places are back on the cutting block, I guess you could say.
Auction block, lease block.
The auction block, lease block. Yeah. So you have things like that happening. You then have the freezing of funds and grants towards habitat work that a lot of organizations were working on. Like Trout Unlimited, I know, has lost dollars. I've talked to people who they were doing habitat work that now, they're not going to be able to do. You then have the layoffs, like you were talking about there a minute ago. About 10% of the National Forest Service, workforce was involved in those layoffs. Now, between the layoffs and then the resignations due to the fork in the road proposal, about 10% of the National Park Service workforce is now gone. So there's this whole array of things happening right now that are going to lead to possible challenges with management of public lands, funding issues with public lands, and all of that possibly feeding into what has been, again, a rising tide of people saying, well, public lands are managed horribly by the federal government. We should transfer them to the states or get rid of them. There was the lawsuit in Utah, claiming that they should get all their federal public lands. There's the proposal and the Wyoming state legislature voting to demand all of their federal public lands other than Yellowstone National Park to be given to the state of Wyoming. So this is a kind of rising tide of all of these things that potentially seriously threat our public lands. And that's like our current version right now, Kel, right? That's what we're experiencing here in early 2025.
And if I interject, just because you covered so much there, like, I think it's really, really important, again, to remind people that oil and gas, mineral extraction, that also goes in this bucket of things that are not going to affect the national debt. So, like, at the end of the day, like I've said a couple things that I want people to remember, but like, I want every American to value their public lands. I also want them to just understand that as we continue on here, and we may or may not be faced with these questions of, do you want to trade this for that? We will not be trading natural resources to reduce the national debt. That is not what's going on. It will increase our gross domestic product, which makes it look better in relation to the national debt. So, these insanely complicated, unbelievable areas that you mentioned, right? Just take the boundary waters, right? That is a freshwater reserve that is absolutely critical to life in the United States. And, I think for very good reason, there was a moratorium on mineral withdrawal under the last administration that I feel like had overwhelming public support. Now that's up for review. And the company that wants to go in there, Twin Metals, is not American owned, is a foreign entity, like many major mining companies, right? So what we are going to be getting out of that are, and folks need to look up the Mining Act, 1872 and 1875.
Yeah.
And see what we get, because again, we don't have nationalized federal mining operations or nationalized federal oil and gas operations, right? The US government is not taking anything to market, and that is by design. People did not think it was fair to other Americans trying to make a living to go out and compete against the federal government, right? So when we talk about this stuff, you got to understand that. We're not getting some giant chunk of the tax pie, right? I think the US government has only pulled in, us, the American people, I think has only pulled in like $400 billion off of mining leases since 1872. So, that's would basically be enough to service the national debt right now. Pay the juice, if you will. Nothing. I mean, it's a spit in the bucket in the ocean. So the other thing, to go back to the fact that are our lands managed better than private entities? Are our lands managed better than state entities? Well, gang, we're getting exactly what we wanted. People don't want the federal government to compete with private enterprise. So we've shackled their ability to do so, right? Like, that's why the regulations, the lease fees have never been updated. That's why the boots on the ground workforce is always very limited. There's always more to do. So it's insanely disingenuous, to the point where I will tell you and everybody listening, it is not about management. It's just not about management. It has more to do with a bunch of entrepreneurial types so freaking pissed that they cannot figure out a way to make money off of what we all publicly have and are and is managed by us, by the people, right? It is land for the people, wildlife for the people. Very, very American ideals. That's what's driving this. It's not this idea about management. And if anybody, like, I'm going to cuss here, so hold on to your ears, kids. When you hear people be like, oh, well, private land's managed so much better, you should say, well, I should fucking hope so. Like, I should hope so. A private, like, I can go out in my lawn and manage that thing any way I want to. I can hear Mark's feedback. I can hear my girlfriend's feedback. I can hear other people's feedback. At the end of the day, it does not matter at all. Yeah. That is my lawn. I get to manage it for me.
Yep.
That is not a comparison to federally managed lands. Not in any way, shape, or form. Federally managed lands are a very different thing, and people need to understand that.
And that's a feature, not a bug, I would argue. And by that, I mean, that's part of what, yes, it is part of what makes federal public lands challenging to any one particular user base. They might say, well, they're not doing everything they possibly could be doing that I would like them to do. But what makes our federal public lands really special is that they are, to a large degree, mandated to be managed for multiple uses. So there's not one single entity that gets everything they want. There's not one single user base that gets a free-for-all. This is for all of those things you mentioned. Yes, there's going to be sustainable resource extraction. That's important. There's going to be some grazing. There's going to be some mining. There's going to be some logging. There's also going to be protections for clean water. There's also going to be wildlife. There's also going to be recreation. And if we want to, like you said, if we want to go to the private land route, you better be ready that maybe your user base, maybe your use just isn't going to be prioritized by that particular private land entity or state, and you just might be shit out of luck. But with the federal situation we have right now, we have a set of regulations and systems and processes in place to, as best as possible, manage for the many. And it's never perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than what we've seen happen in many other countries or many other places where, it's the king's deer, the king's land, or it's the state's land, and then before you know it, it's not too terribly profitable, and they sell it off, and it's gone, and it's nobody else's, or it's paved over and turned into a Walmart. So,
man. Like, listen, if somebody wants to tell me that our federally managed lands are a socialist or a communist construct, I will buy you a frickin' plane ticket and encourage you to go hike around on government-owned land in a socialist or communist country.
Yeah.
You're probably going to get shot. Like if that's the experiment you want to run.
Yeah, I see our public lands as the maybe one of the most shining examples of democracy. Right?
It's Americanism, not communism.
Yeah.
Americanism, not socialism. Right?
That argument falls. That one falls on deaf ears for me. I don't see that one at all. But
yeah, and
it continues to be made.
It's like, is it hard? Yeah, it is. Right? And the reason that things got complicated is because we had, timber barons, oil barons, mining barons, folks that before regulations were put in place and we were just left up to our own devices, these folks thought, holy shit, I better get it while the getting's good. Yeah. Right? And they came in and just, decimated stands of timber for the couple viable trees that are in there, and leaving the rest on the ground. Like they set back good timber production for decades, if not hundreds of years in certain areas. Because they were like, man, if I don't get it, somebody else will. Yep. So that's where a lot of this stuff came from. It's not, and again, like I kind of hate saying the government, because you and I, everybody listening to this, we are the government, which goes way back to one of the first things that you talked about, which is, geez, doc, I don't think it's a good idea to cut my leg off to save my arm before we at least have a conversation about why that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. I think people have just gotten freaking lazy with our democratic system here, right? Like your job doesn't end at election day.
Yeah. Like
you have got to be reminding your elected officials what's important to you. I say it all the time on my podcast, right? Like if you don't advocate for yourself, somebody else will, and you might not like how they do it.
Yeah.
So you better make some time, right? And I think right now it's a really good time. Very simple call to action to just get a hold of your senators, Congress people, and just say, hey, here's my spring, summer plans on our public lands. Very important to my family. This is what we do. This is how much money we spend. Please make sure that they're still there by Memorial Day, by 4th of July weekend. Sorry, Independence Day. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. People need to know that we're thinking about this and it's important at minimum.
So that's a perfect segue to where I want to take stuff next, Cal. We've kind of established like what's happening right now. What's the current version of this right now? But really key point to remember for anyone listening is that there's been some different, slightly different version of this, 8 years ago or 6 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And there's going to be some new version of this 5 years from now or 20 years from now or 10, right? There's always going to be some other interest that would rather use our public lands for maximum profit or whatever. Use them up, give them away, sell them off. There's going to be some version of that at some other point in time. We've also fought back against this in the past. So what I want to spend the rest of our time doing, Cal, though, is talking about, okay, given that we're in one of those moments now today, how do we best use the tools in our toolbox to, stand up against that, to protect these places, to fight for our opportunities and for this public land system that we have. You mentioned one of them, which is calling your senators, but I'd love to kind of dig into some of the weeds on this a little bit, because you hear the standard, do this and that. And that is important, but I think that there's maybe some lessons that we've learned over the last handful of years that maybe will allow us to do this even better this time around, and maybe even better the next, because, there's going to be a next, and there's going to be a big one right now. So that said, one of the big questions I've had, Cal, the last 6 weeks or so, as these specific current threats have been popping up, is around timing. Like, when's the right time to be, raising our voices about this? Because there's been some people saying, well, just wait. just wait and see. Let's let the dust settle. Let's see, if these things that are being proposed actually happen before we call our senators or do whatever. So my first thought is, what are your thoughts on timing? Is this something where we should be waiting to see and then going, or should we be early and often and always? That's something I'm thinking a lot about.
Oh yeah, man. It's very worthwhile. Conservation's a high turnover game because things just don't end, right? And it's funny too, right? Because like our biggest conservation success stories come from the biggest conservation failures, right? Damn near killed all the waterfowl in this country.
Yeah.
What do we talk about as like our number one conservation success story?
Run it back.
Waterfowl.
Yep.
So I would joke, like, wouldn't it be nice just have a really boring story, right? There's no story arc. It's just, we did a really good job.
We didn't screw it up.
Right? But like, that's not how our community or really any community operates, unfortunately. If there was like a socialist construct we could implement in America, it would be stewardship. Like, it'd be like, Trump had kind of like toyed around with, or the idea, or maybe he still brings it up, of military service for citizenship. I would like lump into that civil service, right?
Yeah.
And get people to understand like what we have, why it's important to this country, from national defense to health, clean water, clean air, all those things, right? Blocking off areas for agricultural production, things that we really need long term, versus this short term thinking of like, well, how do we make money on it right now? And by and large, our federally managed lands, they do make money. It's, people have a hard time, especially when you start thinking in terms of gross domestic product to national debt ratio. Federal dollars spent widely are considered with a 3x multiplier on the economy, right? So if you pay that timber cruiser that just lost her job $40,000 a year, there's a $120,000 impact on the local economy.
Wow.
So, which is a benefit. It accomplishes our goal of that GDP to national debt ratio. It's just like, where else are we losing money? Anyway, what I would say in regards to timing is, you want to, once a week at this point, you want to say, hey, just what I said. This stuff's important to me. I want you to know. Try to find something your senator or congressperson has done well currently or in the past, and say, hey, remember when you did this? We need more of this right now. This is what my summer looks like. I want more good work out of you. I want you here, type of thing. I think that is going to be important, because that may stave off some things that could potentially be really bad, really shocking. Showing up in person, any volunteer event, for any organization, aside from, join an organization, get the newsletters, try to just show up in person. One thing that I'll tell you from, just the little bit of lobbying up on the hill that I've done is, an in-person meeting is way, way different than an email or a phone call. And if there's a public event, public lands rally, the diversity that shows up in the room for public lands is very concerning to somebody who wants to be elected. right? They go, oh, wow, here's a physical representation of people who vote. And it's hard for them to lump people into categories when they all show up in person. And it's like a magical thing. It may seem a little frivolous at times, but holy cow, it makes people think.
Sends a
Like
message.
it's very important. I'd say it's very important. And then you know, sign up for these newsletters, and all these conservation groups are going to be working really hard to keep you informed. And there's ideas that, like, with the sovereign wealth fund, how are we going to fund that? Need to sell off assets. Our public lands are considered assets. That's how they're being discussed, as like a real estate transaction. Um, I'd love to study real estate. Doesn't make sense to sell. Like, if you're planning a family estate, the longer you can hold on to stuff, eventually it goes up in price. We're planning a country, right? Like, we're not saying in 30 years we're going to retire. Like, this is for the long, long, long haul. Does not make sense to sell this stuff. But people are saying this is how we are going to address the national debt. This is how we are going to fund a sovereign wealth fund that's going to provide kickbacks. And man, for me, that's just like a line way too far, especially when we have a government that provides zero guarantees that we're not going to end up right back in this position.
Yeah.
And have literally no pot to piss in at that point.
So you bring up something though that I've wondered about, which is, there's these red lines. There's like the shocking things you're talking about, the stuff where the shit really hits the fan.
Yep.
And some would say, well, you're going to burn your powder too soon if you are freaking out and calling or emailing your senators for this first round of layoffs, or if you're throwing a fit because of an executive order that hasn't actually been implemented yet, just proposed, or if you were to, basically the idea here is that you're crying wolf too soon, and then when something really, really, really shocking actually happens, then you don't have ammunition left, or nobody's listening because they're sick and tired of you, etc. Is there any validity to that, you think? And then B, how do you combat that, if that is like a possible thing we have to think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, right? And I think it's very much like a strategy of some folks within this administration is you get a lot of hyperbole out there. Inevitably, that hyperbole is fought with more hyperbolic statements, and eventually you just tune it out because you don't know what's true or not. So,
yeah,
I think avoid that as much as you can. It sucks when you're going slow and trying to be accurate and make concerted, concise statements, and other people are not. But that is the risk you run. It's like we're going to whip up into a frenzy, and you'll see a lot of those folks have to make these like hard pivots and be like, "Oh no, that's what we meant. Oh wait, no, this is what we meant." And it certainly isn't appealing to me. But that should not stop you at all. You should have this line of communication. You're guaranteed this line of communication to your elected officials, where you can always just say, "Hey, this stuff that's happening, I don't really understand it. It's very concerning to me. You need to know this is what's important to me, and I need you to represent those interests."
I like this idea of consistency
evergreen,
too.
right?
Yeah, like the idea that you mentioned of like doing this every week, and that being not overreacting, but simply you're setting expectations. Like, hey, I'm paying attention.
Yep.
I didn't just vote you in for you to then run free. I'm going to hold you accountable. And I think that's a really interesting idea and one that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And man, it is just like you don't need to be one side or the other. You can say, "Hey, I like my tax dollars to be spent efficiently.
Yep.
Please continue down this path of making sure there isn't waste. I would love that." On the other hand, the people that my kids go to school with, uh, they got to pack up and move because they just got laid off. I don't like that. Like, I'm very concerned about how this is going to impact uh, where I live and where I recreate. Like, that's a sensible statement, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, we need more of it, and it unfortunately takes people a long time to kind of get fired up on our side of things.
So we can send form letters when we get the action alerts. We can send customized letters, and basically what you hear is that a form letter, gets kind of thrown into a bucket. Customized letter maybe counts as 5 of those, maybe counts a little bit more, and then a phone call maybe counts as 10x that, or whatever. A phone call is a little bit more paid attention to, possibly, and then I'm sure an in-person visit is 10x that, maybe. So there's these different levers we can pull within the government, and then there's also just the social energy levers we can pull, and that being like telling our friends and family, hey, this is a thing you should pay attention to, or posting about it on social media, or talking about it within your local sportsman's group or your conservation group you're a member of, or in a local chapter or whatever. Like, we can try to make sure this stuff's being talked about and raise the energy and rally grassroots support. That's another thing we can be doing. And it sounds like with connecting with the government frequently, consistently, makes a lot of sense. Keep that going, keep that going, keep that going. What about like the grassroots rallying side of things though, Cal, with trying to not, like, I'm constantly thinking about this personally, trying to avoid issue fatigue, right? Like, if we bring up these things, people get burnt out on them, and then they tire of it, and it's exhausting, and then they're not paying attention when the next big thing arises, and nobody then is able to rally and talk to people and get fired up when they need to. How do you think about that in 2 ways? One, as an individual, just person, and then B, also as someone with a platform. How are you wrestling with that?
Yeah, I literally had a guy at the Montana public lands rally come up and be like, "Man, if you're not burned out, that's a great sign." They're like, "You're always here." Which, for a guilty Catholic conscience, I'm like, "Oh, I'm not here enough." God.
Yeah.
But it is a real thing. I think, if the issue hits home enough, people are going to show up. Like, they're just not going to have a choice. But I guess I should just like explain like how a membership organization works, right? Like, the power behind like backcountry hunters and anglers, when we explain our membership, like we give that demographic information. We say, here's the age range, here's the median income, here's how people vote. And that's really the reason for, filling out those surveys when membership organizations send them out, is it provides like really strong lobbying power when that membership organization is in front of the regulation maker, the lawmaker, the decision maker, to say, hey, this is who we represent. This is how many states. This is like a good slice of the membership pie right here. And it's 30% conservative, 30% liberal, 30% independent. Hard to pin down. They're young. They're energetic. They're people who show up. These are the people that are out there working on public lands and recreating on public lands. That's why you got to listen to us. Like, that's how all of these membership organizations work, right? And some orgs put like more stake in the in different parts of their membership demographic, but and you know, that's what you get when you see people show up in public too, right? Like, you know, I was laughing at our state public land rally because you like look out at that crowd, and it's just so hard to say like, here's a one sentence of who these people are,
Yeah.
right? And it's, you can't, a staffer for a politician can't be like, oh, we have this vote locked up. They can't say that.
Yeah.
Like, it's way too diverse. And especially now, you know, it's like, you know, I think some of the polling is proven, right? It's like Democrats need to get their shit in a pile. They got to restructure. They got to figure out who the heck they are. And there's way more Democratic voters voting for Republicans because they're voting on issues. And these people, I think that's probably a good thing. You know, it's like, get people back in tune with demanding what they want, being vocal about it, staying in touch, and saying, yeah, I don't like this stuff that you're doing. I love this stuff. I want more of this and less of this.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly reasonable, you know?
Yeah. That being allegiance to issues and values versus just a party without even questioning anything, I think is a pretty useful thing that I hope we see an uptick in. But that said, you know, back to this specific set of issues. Okay, so there's this. I think we've kind of covered like consistency is important. Yep. I think being a part of one of these membership groups so that they can, you know, use that membership data and those numbers to then give them some leverage with these organizations. That makes sense.
And it's not an either or, right?
Yeah.
We need you to do both.
Yep. Got to do both. You know, what kinds of, I guess here's another thing I've been thinking about a lot too is where, like, there's a volume control on each of us as individuals that we could turn up and down. And I think like maybe at level like 3 or 4 is like just like consistently keeping our folks aware of what we care about, thanking them for the things that they're doing well, bringing up our concerns on the things they're not doing so well, being a member of these organizations, activating when they ask us to. I feel like that's like a level 3 or 4 on the volume kind of thing, 3, 4, 5. And that's what a lot of people have been doing right now. They're part of these groups. They're giving folks a call when stuff happens. They're keeping tabs on the news and aware of what's happening. What kind of things, Cal, would be a red line moment or a full, you know, blaring red siren kind of moment for you where we need to turn our volume up to 8, 9, or 10? What are the kind of things that would require us and that we need to keep an eye out for, in which we as an outdoor community would have to jump up to a whole nother level of engagement?
I mean, for me, it'd be any sort of land disposal, right? So right now we have a role. It's in the 30-day comment period right now on if you go to the Federal Register, you'll find there's a lot happening on the Federal Register, but you know, it's like a daily ticker of what's been happening from the government. So lots happening right now, but there's a proposal to roll back the NEPA process, which is something that came in under Nixon. And basically it says like everything needs to have a environmental review.
Yep.
Before something happens, there's got to be an environmental review. That's been a real sticking point with a lot of industries, even a big sticking point when you want to do something relatively simple. It can be implemented in a way that makes it just like so burdensome and bureaucratic and crappy that it's not even worth doing, or it can be done really efficiently. There's a large concern that rolling back the NEPA process is going to make it really efficient to categorize and sell off public land. There's a mechanism for public land sales. If you go on the Federal Register right now, there's lots and lots of small acreage sales, which would be like very normal. Sometimes those are part of a land exchange. Lots of things, and they don't need congressional approval to happen. And there's an idea that we're going to see some like larger acreages get jammed in through that same process with the rollback of NEPA. That is going to be a major red line for me. Like, I mean, there's some chunks out there that are not going to be like super beneficial for wildlife, here and there. Is it in the public interest to dispose of it, and I ideally get something else? Yeah, I'd listen to that argument. But there's a fear here that we're going to see some stuff that is really valuable going up on that auction block. That's going to be a red line for me. That's going to be that moment where I'm like, see, this is actually happening. You've got to tune in right now. And if there are rollbacks of the public comment period, that we're guaranteed as citizens, that's going to be a major red line. When we start losing that transparency. A lot of people don't think we have transparency right now, but like everything has a public comment period attached to it. It can just be hard to find unless you're practiced and looking for it, right? And then the other part that kind of goes into your comment about, like the boy who cried wolf or being too hyperbolic, right? Is like, we've seen like Biden administration, there's more oil and gas leasing going on than in the previous Trump administration. That doesn't mean that land's being developed. That's all tied to the free market, which is, also an interesting part of going all the way back to that GDP and national debt conversation. So, as long as those leases don't prevent good management from happening, which is a question mark and something that tried to get done under the Biden administration, where an oil and gas lease, if it's not being used, if that could still be managed for the grazing plan or the habitat plan, so still have wildlife and recreational benefits, even though it's under a lease that's inactive. Yeah, I mean, like lots of rabbit holes here.
Well, okay. So just before you go further, I wanna connect the dots from a couple of these red line moments you brought up to an action, possible action. So what I'm getting at here is, if we have one of these moments where stuff gets particularly dire, or a bunch of these things that have been proposed all of a sudden are actually being implemented. Like if all of these things being proposed all got implemented in a relatively short period, I think there'd be a very real cause for like, holy smokes, this thing's getting put through and this thing's getting put through and this place is gone and this place is, etc. Right? When those moments occur, I'm curious about what the action is that as an individual listening, what that should look like. If the 3 or 4 on the volume is consistent contact with my representatives and my representative and my senators, then when the shit hits the fan and the volume needs to be turned up to 8, 9, or 10, what does that look like then? I'm thinking if I were to answer this, I would say, okay, well, I need to be not just checking in weekly with them, but actually pounding on the door, showing up in person, like you mentioned, trying to make an appointment, or if I've only been sending emails, maybe now I'm making phone calls. I think this is the moment when concerted, unified opposition or getting our voices all together across diverse coalitions matters even more. So I think at that point, I'm not just going to operate as an individual, but I'd be reaching out to all the groups I'm a member of and reaching out to my local chapter leader or the national representative or whoever I can get a hold of and saying, hey, RMEF or NDA or NWTF or BHA or TRCP or whoever, hey, this thing is happening. Are you leveraging our membership and making sure all of our voices are being heard on this? So I'd be looking for, as an individual doing that, I would be pushing for my organizations to be doing that. I would then also be trying to rally whatever network of people I have, whether that be my local buddies in the neighborhood or my social media following or the people I work with or whatever it might be. And I think that we then, as a larger community, need to find ways to then like funnel and create these moments of unified volume. Because I think when you look back, like times when we really broke through the noise and influenced positive change, you can look back and say like the Chavez moment was like kind of like a backbreaking moment for the land transfer movement back then, in which you had a week or so period of time where voices on the left and the right, hunters and environmentalists, climbers and anglers, Joe Rogan and someone on MSNBC or whoever, everyone for a short period of time there was talking about how this proposed bill was a really bad idea for public lands and Americans and wildlife and hunting and climbing and biking and all that kind of stuff. And because everybody talked about it all at once across a diverse coalition, we actually had something very real and tangible happen. I think that moving forward, if some of these things that are, being proposed, if they start happening amidst all of this other change, plenty of it good, by the way, I'm not saying it's all bad change, but amidst all of this noise, amidst all of this stuff going on, we are at very real risk of our issues disappearing in the background because there's stuff about who knows what, Gaza or immigration or whatever. If we don't have coordinated, unified utilization of our community, it'll just be a whisper in the wind and nothing happens because of it. What do you think about all that?
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, I love what you said about accountability for the conservation groups as well. That's something that we definitely saw on the last time, and there was a lot of outreach amongst conservation groups to other conservation groups saying like, "Hey, we need you to be vocal on this." And sometimes these groups don't play well together. And sometimes we as hunters don't play well together because we love to like be identified in a certain way, right? So public landowner t-shirts versus private landowner t-shirts and the jackassery of tribalism, I guess. Public lands are beneficial to all Americans. They absolutely are. If those were to go away, and I mean, Mark, you have way more insight into this, but like, what if all public land hunters became folks competing for private land leases?
Yeah, that'd be a problem for a lot of people.
So I'd turn into a golfer probably. So I'd be out there like really messing up your day if you
pretty
fancy
dire.
yourself a golfer, because I am not. Nor am I big decorum follower too. So if it's a fancy place, a lot of frustration coming down the pipe.
It's kind of a thing at a lot of golf courses too, Kill.
Yeah. Yep. Dog's going to be out there retrieving my ball. So we need to unify, just like we did not all that long ago, right? Like, yeah, yesterday you're a mountain biker. Today you support public lands. You were a kayaker. Now you support public lands. Hunter, horseback rider, motorcycler, single track user, whatever. Like, you got to come together and support public lands. Public lands first, your pursuit second. Put the frickin' election away. Put the user group bullying, put down BS away. That's yesterday's stuff. Like, the reason that we pushed so hard to have that like public land user campaign is because we needed all of our representatives to understand who public land users are, right? And it's just like that showing up in person thing, right? It is, look at who uses these places, look at who is standing up to say like this stuff is super important. They are part of your voter base. Like, they're making the wheels go around on this whole GDP economy thing too, right? So, as I've told a friend of ours in common, it's like, if the good stuff goes away, what's the point? Right?
Yeah.
I've been a taxpayer since I was probably like 16. And if the good stuff goes away, I don't know what the hell the point is.
Yeah.
Right? I will be like, yeah, doc, cut off my leg.
Well, that's the risk though, right? I mean, our buddy Randy Newberg would say that's been the plan for 50 years or whatever it is, as folks have been trying to slowly kill these places, death by 1,000 cuts, to the point where we don't care about the leg anymore. And we're like, hey, I take it, whatever. And so that's important that we don't let it get to that point. Now, give me this, Kel. Give me your take. So if it makes, kind of recapping a little bit there, concerted, unified voice across a bunch of different user groups. We can do it as individuals. We can pressure any organization that we're a part of to make sure that they're a part of this. And of course, then we also need to do what we talked about at the beginning, which is like consistent contact with our representatives. Now we got to ramp it up maybe at some point. But you have a lot of experience and you've done a great job of maintaining that consistent point of contact with your representatives, whether it's a phone call or in person. A lot of people have questions about that. A lot of people are nervous about that, intimidated by that. Can you give me your take on what a good phone call consists of, or what it actually takes to somehow get an in-person, can an individual, reach out to an elected official and somehow get an appointment someday? Or how do you sign up to be able to testify in front of a committee or something like that, whether it be at your state or otherwise? A couple of those specific actions, I think, kind of exist within like a dark black box for a lot of people. And I'd love to kind of uncover that a little bit.
Yeah, it's not something that like comes out in the newspaper before the legislative session that I'm aware of anyway. So I just, I'm like on the older side of millennial. Had that wonderful moment in time when cell phones didn't exist. So I'm not like the most tech savvy person. So I just punch everything into Google and figure it out from there. But it's not intimidating. It's the people's house, right? If you do show up to, it is a little intimidating because there's some decorum there, but people are going to help you out with that. Especially if it's your first time, as long as you're being respectful. So, hop on the Google machine, say, my state's in session, who's my representative? Each representative has at least a little state provided chunk of website, if not their own website. You can sign up for their communications. You can sign up for an in-person meeting. You can try to make a reservation for a phone call a lot of times. Their office numbers are going to be listed. Just call that number to begin with. More than likely, if it's the office number, you're going to talk with a staffer. And this is, for a state like Montana, this would be for like a senator or congressperson, because we've been talking so much about the federal level. Like for a state rep, like this blows people's mind, but and it's taken the wind out of me a couple of times where I've been honestly quite agitated, pissed over some bill that I didn't see eye to eye with. I look up the person, I call the phone number, and I get, hello? I'm like, yeah, who is this? Oh, this is, and it's the representative who introduced the bill, and he's out driving a tractor, and I'm like, damn it. You're just a people, just like
Just
me.
a person.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
And then you say, yeah, hey, I wanted to talk to you about this. And, it's good. They're probably going to ask, if it's a staffer, they will ask, like, where are you from? Like, what's your tax address, basically, is what they're saying. So they can say, like, from this region or district, right? And then, yeah, you just keep it short. Say, hey, this is who I am. This is why this matters. Thank you. Make sure the congressman or the senator or whomever gets it. And that's really what happens. It's not a big deal. Like it's their job. It's your job. If you get up while your state's in session, there's all sorts of in Montana, it's called LEG, like legislature, legmt.gov/participate. And I hit that. Our state's in session. Montana's in session right now. I hit that every single day, every morning while I'm drinking coffee, and I roll through what's coming up for testimony. And I'll rip up to Helena. I'm only 2 hours away from Helena, and I'll rip up to Helena if something's going to go into a committee and I have a chance to comment on it. I want to go up there and be present and hold my lawmakers accountable, right? And everybody has the ability to weigh in on a lot of these bills. Like, you'll read these bills and know how they impact you, know how they'll impact generations beyond you, know how they'll impact your rivers, streams, wildlife. It is not above you. It just is not.
What does it take to sign up to be able to testify in front of a committee like that? Do you have to sign up somewhere and go through some kind of screening procedure, or can you literally find out when that's happening and show up that morning and sign in on a piece of paper on a clipboard and wait your turn, and there you go?
Piece of paper and a clipboard is still how it's done in the great state of Montana. You can also testify online, which is great. It was 20 below and whiteout snowstorms during the legislative session, for part of the legislative session. So that's an awesome option. And a couple of the online ones that I was set to testify on, through the wonderful world of politics, they actually got settled favorably. Those bills got tabled before I even had a chance to testify. It was great. They did it without me, Mark.
What can you do?
Yeah. But yeah, so they want you to sign up 2 hours ahead of time. Right? So,
I have to unfortunately cut us a little bit short due to a family situation. All right, we had to take a brief, impromptu 24-hour break there. Sorry, Cal. But we left things off where you had been telling me about kind of best practices for, calling your senators or congressman or woman, and then what's all involved with actually showing up for in-person testimony or meeting with someone. I've got kind of two final last things I just wanted to quickly touch on with you. And one of those is about this flip side of the equation. We've spent a bunch of time talking about how you reach out to your elected officials. But then there's this other side of what we're trying to do, which is actually getting just average, everyday people, us, involved and engaged and kind of rising up and talking about and advocating on these things. So how do we get our friends and family members and peer group and coworkers, how do we engage them? Help them be aware of these things, activate them to get involved with all this kind of stuff. And one thing I've seen a lot of on social media around this issue is there's a lot of, your team did this, so you guys are a bunch of assholes. Or, well, this is my team and, they're doing some really good things, so I don't think we should give them a hard time about this one because I like everything else they're doing. And you're an asshole because you're giving my team a hard time. And there's all this kind of back and forth and name calling and your team versus my team. And it gets ugly really fast. I mean, you've seen it in the comment sections of lots of things out there around this issue. And I don't see that really helping at all. I don't see that leading to any minds being changed. I don't see that leading to anyone wanting to get more involved and advocate for our public lands. It's just not helpful. What I have found helpful is, approaching the idea of protecting our public lands and encouraging other people to do the same through like shared values by pointing out, hey, you love to deer hunt on this stuff. I love to trout fish on this stuff. Or maybe you love to ride your UTV on this stuff. And I love to camp out here, or whatever the thing is, but finding something that we share in common around these things and framing, our ideas or the way we're trying to share this with other people around that versus you versus me, your guys versus my guys. And I'm just kind of curious, Cale, if you have any thoughts on that when it comes to, how should we be talking about this publicly? How do we bring this up to our mom or dad or our buddies? How do we get more folks to do the kind of stuff that you've been talking about so that we're in a better position and our public lands are not threatened in the future?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good points, Mark. I think, getting through this barrier that, you're not a hypocrite if you vote for somebody, but you want them to perform better someplace else. Like, just recent example, right? Like, I have a friend, he's been married, he's got kids, he forgot to take one of the kids to school, and his wife, who is very, very invested in him, very invested in raising their children together. That, it is team, family unit, first and foremost, right? But that didn't prevent her from saying, hey, it's your turn to take the kid to school. It's very important. You need to improve on your time management skills.
This is an amazing metaphor, by the way.
Right? I mean, it doesn't say our marriage is trash. I don't love you anymore. We're raising these kids all wrong because I'm pointing out that you didn't take the time to get it on your schedule correctly. I may be very frustrated with you in the moment, but I'm not saying all the rest of this is crumbling. It's just I need you to do better on this one thing right now.
Yes.
And I feel like that is something a lot of America should resonate with, right?
Yeah.
And it is not taboo. It's not hypocritical. It is very, very normal. Like, those people put themselves in this position by getting out in front of everybody and saying, elect me. It is our right. It is our duty to say, hey, you are messing this up, and let me tell you exactly why. What's in jeopardy is your job, if you want to go that route. But you can now absolutely say, hey, I love what you're doing over here, telling everybody about it. But what gets thrown back at me is this thing over here. And this thing over here really bugs me.
Yeah.
Right. And in this case, public lands, public water, public wildlife, incredibly important to this country, as we've already covered. And it's something that like everybody really can get behind. And in my personal opinion, the ones who can't, it's because they just don't know a damn thing about them.
Yeah. True. Do you feel like there's anything that we have missed from like a strategic perspective? Because we kind of came into this conversation with the goal of putting together a blueprint or like a game plan for how to fight back against this kind of stuff, either right now or in the future. I think we've talked quite a bit about, having contact with your representatives. We've talked a little bit about what you just mentioned, which is, being willing to speak to our own team about this stuff and not feeling bad about that. We've talked a little bit about, engaging in this kind of thing outside of the partisan bickering. Are there any like tactical things or strategic sides of this that we've missed or glossed over that you think are really important when it comes to like what we actually do?
Well, broad, diverse coalitions is what get things across the line right now, right? And probably forever. We kind of got into this a little bit, but it's like that diversity of membership is a giant strength. So that is something I like to keep in mind. Like HB 307 here in Montana, which is another, misguided effort to fund other programs by stealing habitat funding that we all voted for in Montana. It's really frustrating to me because we brought recreational marijuana into the state of Montana. A huge argument around that was where the taxes are going to go. And it passed because the taxes that come from the sales of recreational marijuana were going to go to fund habitat and access recreation in the state of Montana. And the last legislative session, they got a bill through that stole some of that cash because they were like, oh my God, we didn't know people were going to buy that much pot. And now we got this HB 307 that is doing the same thing with basically the rest of the cash. And we have a surplus in the state of Montana. There's no there's no reason to take this money. It literally like funds state parks and some fishing access sites and things that like people really use. So finding all the ways to represent who and why that stuff's important is really effective. So, I called yesterday and said, hey, I'm representing a business in Bozeman, Montana. It's called MeatEater. We got a bunch of employees. We got an insanely high cost of living in this town. It's brutal. We have very talented people, but things are so expensive here. It's very hard to get those people here. And what gets them here is access to recreation. Like that is a major recruiting tool for us. And the type of people that we want and need in this business are the people who love the outdoors. And they are willing to sacrifice some pay by living in a very, very expensive place because they have access to the outdoors. And that's why this funding is critical. Like it is mission critical to our business, how we operate. And this is how many people we employ. We got a big impact on this town and this economy. That could go away if we don't have access to the outdoors.
I think that's a great way to frame it too for someone to hear.
Yeah. And like when I used to do some fly-ins and stuff back on the First Light side of things, like that's how folks would form groups to go lobby a senator or congressperson. And it's like, okay, we need a tribal interest. We need a business interest. We need a recreational interest. And we need to make sure that everybody has their 5 minutes and 3 good talking points. So our time's really valuable. Like something's going to stick with this person. Because what happens in those rooms, right, is like there's somebody taking notes and they're like, oh, yeah, we heard from the plumbers. Don't need any more plumbers. Heard from the teachers. Don't need any more teachers. Right. So in the rec space, okay, we heard from the fly fishermen. Okay, now we heard from the gear fishermen. Heard from the horseback riders. We need the motorcyclists in there. We need this diverse group of interests. And what we need these folks in office to feel like is it's not me versus that person, it's me versus everybody.
Yeah.
This is a bad idea.
You bring up a good point with that, in that, if you think about every one of us listening right now, we are part of a lot of different groups, right? I think there's something to be said about, we can have our individual influence with like me emailing or calling or showing up and talking to my senator. But then to your point, I think we as individuals can also try to engage whatever other groups we're a part of. So if you're a part of a horse riding club, or if you're a part of a off-roading club, or if you're a part of some organization that's really into trail running or whatever it is, let's get every one of those different groups singing this same tune. Anyone who's dependent on these places, like, we need you. We need the runners. We need the climbers. I want to see Patagonia and First Light and Sitka and Yamaha and Costa and every one of these different businesses / communities / recreational, slices. We all have got to get on this one in future efforts if we want to be heard and actually paid attention to, right? And each one of us can influence some group, whether it's 5 people or 500 or 50,000.
Oh, it is not an exaggeration. And I do get frustrated. I understand where the frustration comes from, but it's like, it's the thing that we were all taught, right? Like little engine that could, or whatever it is, right? It's like, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And it is consistency. And, there's all these avenues that our elected officials open up to communicate with us. They're also two-way streets, right? So if you're clear, concise, respectful on social media, you can hit them there, hit them in their email box, hit them in a public meeting, try to get a private meeting, testify in a committee. There's all these different ways, right? And that's really expected, and enough of it will break through the noise.
I feel like there has been a long period of time where at least we as hunters have had a little bit of a fat and sassy vibe, in that we would say, well, we bought our licenses, we're conservationists, right? Like, I checked the box, bought my license, now I'm good. I think we're getting to a point now, Cal, and it has been for a while, but I think now we also need to kind of say, at least I internally or individually believe that, part of being a hunter, or part of being a backpacker, or part of being any one of these things is also being an advocate for them in the ways that you just described. I think that almost has to be an obligation today, given, the so many different pressures on these public lands and wildlife that we care about. If we want to keep them around for the next 5 years or 50 for my kids now, or my great grandkids, we got to be both. We need to be a hunter and an advocate. It's not really an option anymore, I don't think.
It's not, and the proof is already in the pudding. If you, I think about it this way, right? Like, no hunter likes pressure. We don't like having. I was just explaining to a guy, I'm like, where I grew up, pressure was represented by one other vehicle at the end of that, next to the locked Forest Service gate or at the trailhead. That's what pressure was to me. That's obviously very different now and in a lot of other places. But if the landscape right now would be so dramatically different if every hunter stood up for every disputed easement. Every time somebody buys a chunk of property that has an easement going through it that's designed around public access and people don't weigh in and we lose that just concentrates more and more of us at the same trailheads or the existing easements. And every freaking time, man, people are like, I can't believe that happened. Never again. And then it's like, well, where were you? You said never again. Right. And it's like, we're living in a landscape that we have built for ourselves. And we don't want to admit it. Like we have got to be consistent and it's got to become normal and just part of what we do, and we will reap the benefits for it. Like going back to the presidential election, right? Like what happened in October, November, the Democrats and the Republicans were like, oh my God, this big group of people that identify as hunters also identify largely as independent voters. Everybody's saying the race is going to be super tight. We need the hunters. We need the hunters. We need the hunters. Like they do. They need the hunters. And that also signals to everybody who's a hunter to say, hey, you guys needed us to get elected. This is what we need you to do. And it does not matter who you voted for. And man, if I can make a plea again, and I know I've made several on this podcast, is like, election's over, man. Who gives a crap at this point? Like, it is over. Don't point fingers at people. Don't say, oh, you voted for this. Like, sit and simmer in it. Like, that has never, ever been how our politics have worked in America. We have this beautiful system where you can continually weigh in. And again, man, if you don't do it, somebody else will, and you may not like what they have to say on your behalf, right?
So true. So, Cal, you've got one of the best platforms for keeping people up to date on these kinds of issues and helping people understand how they can take action and do this kind of stuff. Can you just remind listeners here as we close things out on where they can catch your podcast, where they can take action on some of the things you talk about there on the podcast, and anything else you want people to know about?
So the Cow in the Wild feed on the MeatEater network is supposed to be like quick download of information every week, and we can point you in a lot of directions from there. But yeah, the Cal's Week in Review is kind of like the news source, and there's plenty of this in there, and try to grab something from as many states as possible. But just kind of like a buyer beware, there is the intention is to just get you fired up about things that are happening. So you are motivated sufficiently to check for yourself what is going on in your state. That's the end goal.
What's that URL for the website where folks can get links to take action on the things you talk about? Can you remind me of that?
It's just at the the /Cal page at themeateater.com.
Okay. That's smart. I like that you guys have links to, actually send the form letters or do different stuff on some of the issues you bring up. You do a great job with it. I enjoy it. I know a lot of other folks do too. So thank you for doing that, Cal, and thanks for having this chat. I think we should do more of these. Yeah,
man, I agree. It'd be great. We can throw an extra drop on my feed, or I think, trying to engage that YouTube audience would be really good. So folks can write in to ask Cal at themeateater.com and let me know what your interest level is there. And then Mark and I can team up and get something going on the appropriate channel. But plenty more to come. So please be engaged right now. Do the easy stuff. Hey, thank you for doing this. I appreciate that. Boy, I wish you would advocate for us here, because I don't think it's going well. These things are concerning. I'm paying attention because I think we're going to have some big fights coming up here, and we need you to be there and ready to rock and roll. So we can get back to talking about the super fun hunting and fishing stuff.
Agreed. All right, and that is a wrap. Thank you so much for being here. Hope you enjoyed my chat with Cal. I appreciate you chewing on these ideas, considering these perspectives, and taking action in support of our public landscapes now in 2025, next year in 26, and 27, and 28, 29, 30, 2040, 2050. This stuff's going to keep on coming back up. The specifics will be different, but the basic idea will be the same. And we're going to have to be here standing in their way every time. I know I'm going to be there. I'm excited to see you there too. So until then, thank you and stay wired to hunt.